Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. The last few videos I've been doing have been on Angie McCartney, and she's been an interesting character, and we got to see her observations on people she met when she got married to Paul's dad, Jim. And the last episode she talked about Linda McCartney, Jane Asher, and even Elton John, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad that the viewers have been enjoying the episodes also. And it's nice to see the Beatles through the eyes of people that they interacted with. And, we've probably all heard the regular stories before, so we get to see new bits of information from these people. So Angie's been a great source of finding out more about Paul and even about John and George and Ringo. So it's been interesting. So let's see what she's up to today. One time when Angie, Ruth, and Jim were staying with Paul, one of the rare times she stated, it was at Paul's house at Cavendish Avenue, and at the time it was only Linda, Paul, and Heather. So Paul got an impulse to go out for afternoon tea, and this sounded good to Angie, and everybody got ready to go. Little Heather put on a blue organza frilly party frock, and she insisted on wearing her blue wellies with it. They went to the Savoy Hotel and were ushered in by a waiter who was excited to see a famous face with a posse. They were seated in the quiet restaurant. Angie said they were treated to all the usual afternoon tea delights, with the white glove service, cake tongs, 3-tiered cake stands, cucumber finger sandwiches, strawberries and clotted cream, and of course ceremonial pots of tea. Angie said it was as if they were royalty. Ruth was little then, and she was starting to become aware of her surroundings, according to Angie. And Jim and Angie were impressed too, though they tried not to show it. At one point, Heather stood up in her chair and caused a bit of a ruckus, which didn't go over well with the other diners, and a nervous waiter came over to ask if they would tone it down. He wasn't well received. Ruth said that poor Jim was mortified. He was from the old school. Don't make a fuss. Don't draw attention to yourself. Paul and Linda felt like they should have things their own way. And Angie said there was a difference in their attitudes between the older and younger generation. Angie noticed it when they went out the front door of the Rembrandt one day to get into the car. Linda went right up to the front seat with Paul, and Jim had to sit in the back, surprised by it. He felt that being the older man in the family, it would be expected for him to sit up front and the women sat in the back. Angie said times have changed since then. Now she talks about the Carpenters. Like millions of people, she was fascinated by the music of the Carpenters in the early 70s. She heard that they would be at the Liverpool Empire, and she had to get tickets. She said in those days, when a big American act was announced, people stood in lines around the block on the opening day of sales for tickets, and there wasn't a ticket master back then, and patience was a virtue. Paul had come home to Rembrandt for a couple of days, and his cousin named Ian Harris was visiting. He was also a huge Carpenters fan. When Paul heard that Angie and Ian wanted to go see the Carpenters, he called Alistair Taylor in London and got him to wave his magic wand, and Alistair got some tickets for Ian, his daughter, Liz, Ruth, and Angie. Angie said they were thrilled with the concert, and they got to meet the Carpenters backstage after the show. Karen, she was still playing the drums then, and so she was exhausted. And she and Richard were very nice, and they were happy to see the group. And the Carpenters sent their best wishes to Paul, whom they held in high esteem. But Angie said, who didn't? Ruth was too shy to ask for an autograph, but treasured the evening's printed program. She kept it in her trove of keepsakes for a long time, until it disintegrated. Angie said that they didn't have scanners in those days, and time taught them to digitalize a lot of stuff since then: photographs, autographs, programs, tickets, etc. She said she didn't need to digitalize the memories of the Carpenters. They would remain in her head. Now she comes to the sad part about the death of her husband, Jimmy Mack. Angie said that Jim's health deteriorated over a period of several years, and he had had arthritis just before they met in 1964, to his sad passing on March 18th, 1976. She said that, bless him, he was willing to try anything that was suggested. Treatments included hot hand wax to foot baths, acupuncture to calcium injections, and many oils and medicines. Angie said Jim was pretty active and loved to work in his garden and greenhouse and go for walks every day down to Heswall, Lower Village. with a stop at Victoria Hotel for whiskey and water when she first met him. And then Paul bought him a cottage in Carrog, North Wales, and he loved to go on fishing trips on the River Dee. And when the illness took over, he wasn't able to do those things, and he sat in his chair and watched a lot of TV. He loved American programs like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and Dallas, but he was the happiest when he could watch afternoon racing from the various English tracks. This would give him the opportunity to bet on the races. He would call his bookie in Liverpool, and Angie said she would periodically drive him through the Mersey Tunnel to either collect his winnings or pay his debts. When Jim had to have knee replacement surgery, it took Jim a long time to get better. They had a good man named Ken Casey to come to the house to help him with physical therapy. And there was another man named Roger Waterworth who was blind and whose wife used to drive him around. They both did wonderful work to try to help Jim, but the disease kept getting worse. The weather in England with the rain, the fog, and the dampness didn't help. Angie said if we only knew what we know now, maybe Jim could have asked Paul to buy him a little place in Arizona or Palm Springs where the dry desert air would have helped him out. Angie said it was hard to see Jim deteriorate and lose his independence. Then there was a different opinion in the family as to how to handle Jim's final days. And Jim always told Angie that he wanted to die in his own bed and not some hospital. Some of the older generation of the Mack family thought Angie should be asking Paul to pay for a nursing home. Angie said she tried to explain to them that they were doing what Jim wanted, and in their grief they just couldn't accept that. Angie said that the last week of Jim's life they had a night nurse so that Angie could get a few hours sleep. Angie said that in the distressing times like that, sleep seemed to evade one. Mike's first wife, Angie, was with Ruth and Angie sitting at Jim's bedside when he finally left them. She had her youngest daughter, Abby, with her, and when Jim took his last breath, little Abby said, "Oh, look, Poppy stopped," Angie said, out of the mouths of babes. Angie said she never saw anyone die before, and no matter how prepared you are for it, it comes as a terrible shock. Angie said we all kissed him and said a little prayer and hugged one another and cried. Jim was surrounded by loved ones, and Angie said that's how she would like to go too, or maybe to be shot by a jealous lover. Now we have another sad event, the death of John Lennon. Angie said she remembered the date, December 9th, 1980. That is when they heard that John Lennon had been murdered the night before. Ruth and Angie were living in King's Lynn and had gone into the office early to decorate the reception office. Ruth was on a ladder with a roll of wallpaper, and Angie was on the upper floor doing manual bookkeeping in big blue ledgers for artists they had managed at that time, the biggest name being Gary Glitter. One of the young assistants came into the office and asked, "Have you heard the news?" Then they turned on the radio and they heard the unbelievable. She said that they were visited that day by Jeff White from the band Paris 9 and his companion Cardi. They had to drive from Liverpool to King's Lynn to spend time with them. She said they all went eating at a local Chinese restaurant that night, or was it Greek? And they were all stunned. She said she'd never been close to John, but he was like family because of his closeness to Paul. Even though 3 decades had passed, John's death was still felt in the McCartney household. Then she speaks about Michael Jackson. Angie remembered when Paul told her and Ruth that he had been advising Michael Jackson to get into publishing. And the publishing meant that it was buying up people's catalogs, just as Paul himself had done with many things, ranging from the Canadian national anthem to the works of John Philip Sousa, and many more. But Paul may have regretted that when Michael's people got Paul and John's early compositions, and it became a legal wrangle for a long time, ending with Paul not even owning the publishing of his masterpiece Yesterday. And Paul, his publishing company was entitled MPL, and it was formed in 1971. So Michael took Paul's advice and extended his reach into the Beatles catalog, and it was eventually sold to Sony. Angie said, talk about a long and winding road. But it seemed like I remember now that Paul got his catalog back, so I hope that's true. Now we have another sad ending. Rest in peace, Linda. So one sunny afternoon in April 1998, the phone rang at Angie and Ruth's home in Playa del Rey. It was Lyle Gregory, a radio producer who wanted her to go live on the air in a few minutes to talk about Linda McCartney's passing. Angie said at that time she didn't know anything about it, and it was a terrible shock. Angie called Ruth and tried to gather her thoughts, and within seconds, Lyle was back on the air, connecting her with the radio host, Michael Jackson. Paul and the kids had wanted to keep it as quiet as possible, and the first story that came out was incorrect, saying that Linda died in Santa Barbara, California, when in fact it was their ranch in Tucson, Arizona. Angie said she was sad and shocked and didn't know what to say, and she was unprepared. Being live on the radio wasn't an easy way to grieve. Angie said she didn't know what she said, and she said, "I only hope that I treated the news with the respect that it deserved." Angie said that she has had more than a decade to think about what to say, and she thought that Linda was a devoted wife, a wonderful mother, and one of the greatest advocates for ethical treatment of animals. And before Linda met Paul, she was a single mother with her daughter Heather, and things hadn't been easy for them. While she was in the U.S., Linda would have various trusted people sit with Heather while she went out on photographic assignments. And she met Paul doing a photographic assignment. Linda loved to cook, ride horses, and be beside her loving husband. She was always happiest with animals around her. Angie said she can remember waking up in the middle of the night when she was at Rembrandt, and Paul and the family had arrived from the farm in Scotland. In addition to the dogs, she could hear clucking sounds, and they had stopped somewhere along the way and bought some hens. And she put them in the downstairs cloakroom until morning, when she and Angie cleaned up the chicken poop. Linda had lined the floors with newspapers and put down dry food and bowls of water for them, but the hens made the room look like a war zone. Linda put them inside newly bought cages and prepared driving them back down to London. Linda never wanted to be on stage and perform, but Paul wanted her in wings, so she did what he wanted. She got grief from fans and the press, but she battled on and then established her vegetarian line of frozen foods and cookbooks. Angie said she thought she may have been working on another cookbook when she passed away. Angie said that there were plans to have someone else carry on her legacy, and she had a couple of beautiful books that Linda had signed and given to Angie. Angie said the saddest part was that even with Paul's success and fortune, in the end there was nothing he could do to prolong her life. He was at her bedside with the kids when she finally closed her eyes and was out of her suffering. And her name and memory live on in Liverpool, where Linda McCartney Cancer Center is a dedicated organization working towards a cure, and it's also there to comfort victims and their families while they're undergoing treatment. Angie said she donates a portion of the profits she gets from her little tea company to those good folks. Now she talks about May Pang. Angie said she met May Pang years ago at a Beatles Fest in Chicago, and the fest included Cynthia Lennon. Angie and Cynthia were on a panel together, answering questions from the fans. The moderator said he had a surprise for us, and it was May Pang. Angie was shocked at first, wondering how Cynthia would receive her, because May and John had been an item at one time. Well, come to find out, they had had a warm history together. They embraced and were very friendly. They continued to keep in touch through the years. May was originally personal assistant to John and Yoko, and she became a great photographer, and her book, Instamatic Karma, had many great pictures. When she hung out with John, she wasn't sure if she should take her camera out. John insisted. He thought that May captured him in ways no one else did, because he was comfortable with her. She had pictures of John sailing with young Julian, and even one of John signing the legal papers that officially ended the Beatles' partnership. Angie said that May was an active lady, a single mom with 2 grown children, to her former marriage to producer Tony Visconti. Now she has a regular radio podcast and a line of feng shui jewelry. Angie said that, like a lot of Beatle ladies, she emerged from the shadows and is thriving. Now Angie talks about leaving Liverpool. Angie said that after Jim passed away, her and Ruth had their circumstances change. She said they moved a lot in the different phase in their lives. Angie said she made a bad decision that wasn't the wisest. It was a bad business decision, and it cost her everything, including the little flat that she and Ruth moved into after Jim died. She said, like the Rod Stewart song, "I wish that I knew then what I know now." They moved to King's Lynn in Norfolk, then on to London, took a number of jobs, learned who their real friends were, and picked up the pieces. They had a stroke of good luck and got a pair of tickets to Australia, where they began a whole new life with the help of their longtime friends, the Crawfords, who gave them a home and their newly constructed extension. Angie then goes into the twists and turns and the adventures of her life after Jim passed away. Angie said in 1980, when they lost their Merseyside home to the bank, her and Ruth moved to King's Lynn in Norfolk, and she said it was a sleepy little town, but full of characters. Angie and Ruth lived in rented flats, one being in the Tilney All Saints. It was out in the boonies with wild bats that would fly around the rafters after dark. Then they got a flat close to High Street offices, which was above a bowling and social club in Queensland at Sandringham. It was across from the village church where the royals would sometimes visit, and they had the press after them wanting to take photographs from their upstairs windows. Ruth and Angie were amused to see the Queen Mother driving her green Ford Fairmount around the area. She would go into the local sweet shop to buy treats for her grandchildren, and they saw her private detective sitting on the passenger side looking very pale as the dear old lady would drive in her own way. She was very petite and could barely see over the top of the steering wheel. She said the Queen Mother was never without one of her floppy hats. Angie said that Ruth planned to buy a property from the £5,000 remaining from a small trust fund that Jim had left her to put a roof over their heads. So she found an old, delightful property, which was part of a group of mill houses overlooking a courtyard. Angie said that they were one floor up, and they found out they had a cranky elderly lady living downstairs who used to rant a bit. The previous owners were brother and sister, and the elderly lady thought something improper was going on and used to bang on the ceiling and yell. Angie wondered what the lady thought about her and Ruth. Then this lady started to break the windshields of every car parked outside her front door. She would often shout about coming up to visit them and bringing a piece of cheese for the cat, but they didn't have a cat. Angie said that one evening, as they were sitting in the window seat and looked down at the courtyard, they saw an old lady in a white nightgown, and she had long white hair and carried a lit candle and an old-fashioned candle holder. She appeared in one window and then seemed to walk into the next one, and then the next one. And when they talked to the neighbor about the sighting, she said that would be the ghost of a lady who lived there, who's still waiting for her husband to return home from the sea. And then one time they had a friend staying with them, and she slept in the same room as Angie. She woke Angie up in the middle of the night to say she had just seen the original exposed beams of the house, yet when she turned on the light, the newly refurbished surface was securely in place. They would frequently find the windows open when they returned home from work at night, windows they knew were secure when they left. Then there were the lights and the stove warm on a couple of occasions, so Ruth and Angie knew they weren't alone. Well, I'd get out of that place. So they had moved there with their little business, Cloth Cap Management, and when all else failed, they were forced to leave their flat and Brincott Walk in Oxton. So I'm going to end the video here. The episode started on a happy note with Paul, his family, Jim and Ruth and Angie, going to a fancy hotel for tea. Then Angie got to see the Carpenters thanks to Paul. And then the stories start to get sad when she mentions the people who passed away. Her beloved Jim, John Lennon, and Linda McCartney. Angie made a bad business deal, so her and Ruth had to start all over again in different places and different jobs trying to get stable. They also encountered a ghost at one place they were staying at and a cranky old lady who lived below them. There was a lot of things happening to Angie and Ruth in this episode, but they had each other and just kept trying to find their way. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would help my channel out too. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.